Siberia region of Russia has a population density of 2.8 people per square kilometer. Only about a fifth of the Russian population lives in this region, despite it making up nearly 80% of the Russian landmass. Much of it is nearly completely unpopulated, and the reasons are pretty simple. It's really cold, full of mountains and harsh weather, and it's just not a great place to live, especially in the eastern and northern regions. However, it's a really cool place to go on an expedition or a hike, which is why it attracts groups seeking a challenge to survive the wilderness. Not everyone comes back. The most famous group who met an unexpected and strange fate was that of the Dyatlov Pass expedition. But there is a significantly less well-known expedition that is, in my opinion, so much more mysterious, and that is the expedition of Khamar Daban. While Dyatlov Pass has some logical explanations, Khamar Daban is still terrifyingly nonsensical. And I don't want to spoil anything because this story is so weird, so let's get into it. So the Khamar Daban mountain range is located near Russia's border with Mongolia, and while the range itself is huge, the Khamar Daban expedition we'll be talking about today took place around here. Hopefully I'm able to put an image there that will tell you where it is, which is actually one of the more popular areas of the range. In fact, there were multiple other hiking groups on the same mountain at the time of the incident. Unfortunately, that wouldn't save anybody. In August of 1993, 7 individuals arrived in Irkutsk, a city located here, north of Lake Baikal. It was close enough to their home in Kazakhstan that they used a train to get there. There were 6 people aged around 18, with some as young as 15, and a 41-year-old group leader named Lyudmila. The trip would be extremely cold and difficult, but all 7 members had plenty of experience and gear. And so they went into the mountains of Khamar Daban, and since the trip was scheduled to be a long one, friends and family were not particularly concerned for a while. 6 out of the 7 members of the group would never leave the Khamar Daban mountains alive. On August the 18th of the same year of 1993, tourists rafting the Sneznaya River spotted an 18-year-old girl waving and calling for help on the shoreline. Her name was Valentina Utochenko, and she was the only surviving member of Lyudmila's group. Authorities took 2 weeks to find the rest of the group, and by then they had been dead for over a month and were in various stages of decomposition. 5 out of the 6 were determined to have died from hypothermia, while 1 was determined to have died from a heart attack. But I heavily doubt this because of a few reasons. Valentina did tell her story to the police. However, we didn't get to hear her full story until about 25 years later. So before we actually get to her account, which is the scary one, I'm going to talk about why I heavily doubt that this group died from hypothermia. Firstly, all the members of the group had much warmer clothing, a dry sleeping bag, and pretty much anything required to get warm in a waterproof bag that none of them decided to open. The authorities posed that Lyudmila had pushed the rest of the group too hard through the falling snow and freezing rain, and that they had all become delirious and had frozen suddenly, I guess. But they were all very experienced and would know their limits. Plus, the weather was not so bad that it would just kill them. There were multiple other groups in the same area at the same time, including a group led by Lyudmila's own daughter. Lyudmila's group was actually scheduled to meet with her daughter's group on the mountain. However, that obviously didn't take place. But Lyudmila's daughter and her group all survived. So how could a group with so much experience all die and then have one member show up miles away at a river below, still, not dead? And that brings us to Valentina Utochenko's account of what happened. Valentina did not give her own account of the events of August 1993 to the public until decades later. She possibly gave some account to the police, but after that became very mentally disturbed and didn't talk about it for a long time. But when she finally did, it probably made this whole event even weirder and even scarier. So according to Valentina, the first handful of days went pretty well, with wonderful progress being made. They hiked nearly 10 miles a day, which with the amount of gear they were carrying, the elevation change, and the weather, it's honestly really, really good time. And being able to do that for multiple days in a row, that actually means that they're very experienced and are in very good shape. They stopped around 45 miles into their journey in an area between 2 of the peaks of the Khamar Daban mountains. Now, strategically, the place they stopped at wasn't really a great place to stay. It was essentially a flat open field on the mountainside with pretty much 0 tree cover, meaning the heavy winds of the mountains would put a stop to any campfire and make the area extremely cold and unpleasant. But for whatever reason, they decided to stay on the 5th or 6th night in this area. And while it was impossible to make a fire, they did survive the night. The next morning, even though they were cold, they ate their breakfast, they packed up their gear, and they continued descending the mountain. What happened next was completely out of nowhere. At around 11 a.m., a 24-year-old member of the group suddenly screamed as he began to foam at the mouth and blood started to pour out of his ears and nose. As he screamed in pain, he clutched at his throat, and as another member of the group approached the first, he began to show the exact same symptoms. Ludmila, the 41-year-old tasked with watching the group, suffered a heart attack, although it may have been caused by the shock of what was happening. Suddenly, most of the group except Valentina and another boy named Dennis were all screaming, clawing at their throats, and a girl named Tatiana even began bashing her head against a rock until she stopped moving. Valentina and Dennis tried to sprint away from the rest of the group, but were only temporarily successful, as soon Dennis began to bleed, foam at the mouth, and collapse. Valentina, realizing she would also likely die in the same way, decided to run away. She ran for miles, finally stopping, setting up a single sleeping bag, as that was all she had when she ran, and went to sleep, believing she would die that night. But to her surprise, the next morning, she awoke still alive, but with just a sleeping bag and what I think is a space blanket, which is basically just a reflective piece of plastic that you put over yourself. It's a very thin sheet and it reflects all your heat. Anyway, with only those two things, as she had grabbed basically nothing else in a rush to get away, and no food or water, it was pretty obvious Valentina was dead without the rest of the supplies. So that morning, she made the decision to risk death once again and hike to the place all her friends had been seen last. When she arrived, it was clear they were all dead. She gathered all the food and supplies she could and began to hike away. She ended up finding a repeater tower that would continue power lines down the mountain, and she slept there for the night, and that next morning, she decided to follow the lines down the mountain. Obviously, following power lines, you're gonna get to wherever the power is going, and she ended up finding a group of houses. However, they were long abandoned. But as she kept going, she found the Sneznaya River. And while the river on its own wasn't really a big help, she was incredibly lucky, and as she was near the river, the group of tourists from Ukraine mentioned earlier discovered her and were able to take her back to civilization. The odds were that she could have stayed near that river for maybe days and never been found. She was extremely lucky to be alive. And not even just from being found at the river, but just in general. I mean, everyone else in her group was dead, but why? And that's what we're going to try to answer right now. There's a few theories for this, and I'm going to put them on a tier list, because some are better than others. And the first few of these theories basically have to completely disregard Valentina's story. There is one that lines up that I personally believe, but we're going to get onto that one later. But we need to go over the other theories first to explain why I came to the conclusion that her story is true. The least strange way that this could have happened was the theory that many at the time believed in Russia. People believed that Ludmila had pushed the group too hard and they had all frozen to death. This theory is backed up by the fact that some of the group had shown slight signs of iron deficiency and showed signs of dying of hypothermia, although Ludmila was determined to have definitely died from a heart attack. The problem with hypothermia as a cause of death is that it's notoriously hard to definitively prove if somebody died just because it was pretty cool. The second problem with this is the fact that it took so long to find the bodies. It took around a month to discover them using search teams and even apparently a helicopter. So if a body had been decomposing for a month, even if it's cold, it's going to be pretty hard to find out a cause of death. The blood and foam at the mouth that Valentina had described was probably already washed away from the freezing rain, and animals had begun to pick away at the bodies. Now, the third and most important problem is that hypothermia makes no sense. As I said before, they had sleeping bags and dry bags, warmer clothes, and they had no reason to just die of hypothermia and then have a teenager somehow survive the next 4 days by herself and be safe. There were other groups on the mountain, everyone was experienced, and it makes no sense. However, it's the most normal theory we have here. While I don't believe it, it's definitely a C-tier theory. I think it's possible. Now, the second theory is the theory that perhaps the group ingested a plant or mushroom which affected them mentally. Maybe somebody mistook a poisonous plant for an edible one. The problem is that the group had plenty of food left, and they knew the area well. It doesn't explain Valentina's story or anything, but I think there's a little believability to it, making this a C tier similar to the first theory. Maybe they ate a plant that poisoned them, or affected them mentally, and something happened. Theory number 3 is that the Russian military was conducting some sort of operation in the Khamar Daban mountains, and Ludmila's group stumbled across something that they weren't supposed to see. It could have been possible that they were tied up, knocked out with some kind of chemical, and then left to freeze, but this doesn't really explain why Valentina would magically still be alive, and there's pretty much zero evidence of this. Plus, there's really no reason for the Russian military to conduct a test in the Khamar Daban when there are significantly more isolated places to do so. Overall, I give this theory a D tier. The next one is an animal attack or something, maybe a yeti, but they froze to death, and I don't know how a yeti could freeze somebody to death. Maybe it has magic ice spell or something. I don't know, F tier. Animals, usually kill and eat people. They don't just magically freeze you and show no signs of injuries. The next one is aliens. F tier. Then we have my favorite theory, the one that I personally think aligns the best with Valentina's story, the one that explains why no one bothered to get out a sleeping bag or warm clothes. That is the neurotoxin theory, specifically Novichok. Now, Novichok is a nerve agent, a really deadly nerve agent, although usually all nerve agents are pretty deadly. Now, there's a lot of people, including YouTubers for this topic, believe that the Russians tested Novichok in the Khamar Daban or in that area. It's theorized the heavy rain allowed the nerve gas to settle, allowing members of the group to walk into small pockets of the agent, which would cause your cells to break down, which could cause internal bleeding, asphyxiation, and cardiac arrest, which is an interesting coincidence to Ludmila's proposed cause of death. You would die really painfully, really quickly from even a tiny dose of Novichok. Now, as I said, this is a theory a lot of other YouTubers believe, and while this is definitely my favorite, I think it has some problems. Yes, the Russians did develop a nerve agent called Novichok, and it was tested in Siberia, but like I said at the start of this video, Siberia is really big, and it would be pretty crazy to test a nerve agent right next to Mongolia, like a different country. Also, Novichok is not usually a vapor or aerosol, it's normally a powder or even a liquid. That being said, this is by far the best theory on this subject, and I give it a B tier, which is not anywhere near the top, but that's the best we got. It doesn't really make any sense for Novichok to be there, but it does line up pretty well. And if Valentina just happened to not walk into a pocket of Novichok, she would have survived. Now, Novichok, like many nerve agents, is clear, odorless and tasteless, and nearly undetectable. So after a month, the deaths of its victims would be hard to identify as being caused by a nerve agent. But once again, even if Novichok was somehow there, which is unlikely, it would probably need to be ingested, making this theory not entirely plausible. Novichok is not normally a gas. And at the end of the day, there are no S tier theories, there aren't even really any A tier theories. None of these seem likely, and that's what's so scary. I feel like usually when people make a video about something like this, they leave out details until the end, and I'm not hiding anything. That's all we know. Let me know what you think happened in the comments, and subscribe if you're new. This is my third video on this channel, so smash a like and subscribe to help me continue the series, and I'll see you all later. Goodbye.